Boo. The last final chapters of Pride and Prejudice. What do you think about that, Janie Austen? How have I been doing? Not well. I'm gonna get better though. By the fifth. Hats. She said, hats off to you, babe. Hats off to you. By the last Jane Austen book, if I'm so permitted to read it, I'm gonna do you justice, girl, but it's been a rough first book, huh? We're gonna get better. We're on chapter LX, which is 60, and the last chapter 61, and then we're done. We're gonna say farewell to Pride and Prejudice. And I haven't gotten Sense and Sensibility yet, so I'm gonna go to the bookstore right after I'm done here. I'm gonna go get Sense and Sensibility, I think, and maybe I'll read some tomorrow. I'm wearing my little Hop Dotty Burger Bar shirt from Austin, Texas. That's where my friend's kid's dad worked before he passed away, which inspired this reading time because I used to FaceTime with his kids and it was just fun to read out loud with them, and so that was sort of the inspiration. And I'm also just on some time off right now, and this feels like a really good productive thing to do for my brain while I'm having some recouping and having some time off. I just don't even want it to end, so I am stalling, but I'm not going to stall anymore, and I promise myself I'm not going to cry. Just kidding. I cry if I want. It's chapter XL, chapter 60. Elizabeth's spirit soon rising to playfulness again, thank goodness. She wanted Mr. Darcy to account for his having ever fallen in love with her. How could you begin? Said she. I can comprehend your going on charmingly when you had once made a beginning, but what could set you off in the first place? I cannot fix the hour, or the spot, or the look, or the words which laid the foundation. It is too long ago. It's been a year. Has it been a year? I think it's been a year. How long did Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy date? That's a fine way to put it. Oh, they did not date in modern sense. Right, just, you know what we mean. Oh, how come it doesn't have to be that complicated. There's another. Know each other. Roughly a few months before their engagement. It hasn't been that long. It was like last spring, and it's like spring. 15th of October, April 9th, October 6th. It's almost exactly a year. Wow, those are like really specific dates. Is it really that specific? Meets on the 15th of October. His first proposal was on April 9th. How do they know? I guess you can figure it out. Oh, it's too long ago. I'm like, yeah, Brian and I met 2007. We started dating November 2007, the very end of 2017 in November. He's like, it's so long ago. Who could tell? I was in the middle before I knew I had begun. Wow. My beauty you had early withstood. As for my manners, my behaviour to you was at least always bordering on the uncivil, and I never spoke to you without rather wishing to give you pain than not. Now be sincere. Did you admire me for my impertinence? For the liveliness of your mind, I did. You may as well call it impertinence at once. It was very little less. The fact is, you were sick of civility, of deference, and of officious attention. You were disgusted with the women who were always speaking and looking and thinking of your approbation alone. I roused and interested you because I was so unlike them. Whoa! Had you not been really amiable, you would have hated me for it, but in spite of the pains you took to disguise yourself. Your feelings were always noble and just, and in your heart you thoroughly despised the persons who so assiduously courted you. Right. He's like, ugh, all these women doting on me and ugh. Isn't it always like that? There, I have saved you the trouble of accounting for it, and really, all things considered, I begin to think it perfectly reasonable. To be sure, you knew no actual good of me, but nobody thinks that when they fall in love. Was there no good in your affectionate behaviour to Jane while she was ill at Netherfield? Oh, that's right. She did like instantly come to Netherfield when Jane got sick. That is sweet. He remembers that. Dearest Jane, who could have done less for her? But make a virtue of it all by a virtue of it by all means. There I go again. My good qualities are under your protection, and you are to exaggerate them as much as possible, and in return it belongs to me to find occasions for testing and quarrelling with you as often as may be. And I shall begin directly by asking you what made you so unwilling to come to the point at last. What made you so shy of me when you first called and afterwards dined here? Why, especially when you called, did you look as if you did not care about me? Because you were grave and silent and gave me no encouragement. But I was embarrassed. And so was I. You might have talked to me more when you came to dinner. A man who had felt less might. How unlucky that you should have a reasonable answer to give, and that I should be so reasonable to admit it, as to admit it. But I wonder how long you would have gone if you had been left to yourself. I wonder when you would have spoken if I had not asked you. My resolution of thanking you for your kindness to Lydia had certainly great effect. Too much, I'm afraid. For what becomes of the moral if our comfort springs from a breach of a promise? For I ought not to have mentioned the subject. This will never do. You need not distress yourself. The moral will be perfectly fair. Lady Catherine's unjustifiable endeavours to separate us were the means of removing all my doubts. I'm not indebted for my present happiness to your eager desire of expressing your gratitude. I was not in good humour to wait for any opinions of yours. My aunt's intelligence had given me hope, and I was determined at once to know everything. Lady Catherine had been of infinite use, which ought to make her happy, for she loves to be of use. But tell me, what did you come down to Netherfield for? Was it merely to ride to Longbourn and be embarrassed, or had you intended any more serious consequence? My real proposal was to see you, and to judge, if I could, whether I might ever hope to make you love me. My avowed one, or what I avowed to myself, was to see whether your sister was still partial to Bingley, and if she were to make the confession to him which I have since made. Shall you ever have courage to announce to Lady Catherine what is to befall her? Lady Catherine's going to be pissed. I am more likely to want more time than courage, Elizabeth. But it ought to be done. And if you will give me a sheet of paper, I shall have it done directly. He's going to write to that woman right now. And if I had not a letter to write myself, I might sit by you and admire the evenness of your writing, as another lady once did. Caroline Bingley. She's going to be pissed. Caroline Bingley and Mrs. Hertz are going to be pissed. I can't even imagine those family dinners. Caroline Bingley's not going to say a word. Who is Caroline Bingley, Mary? Do we ever know who Caroline Bingley married? No, she never marries. At the start of the book, she's a gentleman who lives in Netherfield Park in London. Wow. There you go. Never marries in the book, but in my fantasy world, she marries some, like, one of Wickham's friends. But I have an aunt, too, who must not be longer neglected. From an unwillingness to confess how much her intimacy with Mr. Darcy had been overrated, Elizabeth had never yet answered Mr. Gardiner's long letter, but now having that to communicate, which she knew would be most welcome, she was almost ashamed to find that her uncle and aunt had already lost 3 days of happiness, and immediately wrote as follows. I would have thanked you before, my dear aunt, as I ought to have done, for your long, kind, satisfactory detail of particulars that you like Mr. Darcy so much. But to say the truth, I was too cross to write. You supposed more than really existed, but now suppose as much as you choose. Give a loose rein to your fancy, indulge your imagination in every possible flight which the subject will afford. And unless you believe me actually married, you cannot greatly err. You must write again very soon, and praise him a great deal more than you did in your last. I thank you again and again for not going to the lakes. Oh, yeah, because if they'd gone to the lakes, they wouldn't have gone to Pemberley. How could I be so silly as to wish it? Your idea of the ponies is delightful. We will go round the park every day. I am the happiest creature in the world. Perhaps other people have said so before. Every single person in this book. But not one with such justice. I am happier even than Jane. She only smiles. I laugh. Whoa, competitive. Mr. Darcy sends you all the love in the world that he can spare from me. You are all to come to Pemberley at Christmas. Yours, etc. Wow. Mr. Darcy's letter to Lady Catherine was in a different style, and still different from either was what Mr. Bennet sent to Mr. Collins in his reply to his last. Dear Sir, I must trouble you once more for your congratulations. Elizabeth will soon be the wife of Mr. Darcy. Console Lady Catherine as well as you can. But if I were you, I would stand by the nephew. He has more to give. Yours sincerely, etc. Miss Bingley's congratulations to her brother, on his approaching marriage, were all that was affectionate and insincere. She wrote even to Jane on occasion to express her delight and repeat all her former professions of regard. Oh, yeah, right. Jane was not deceived, but she was affected, and though feeling no reliance on her, could not help writing her as much kinder answer than she knew was deserved. Good for her. Rise above, Jane. The joy which Miss Darcy expressed on receiving similar information was as sincere as her brother's in sending it. 4 sides of paper were insufficient to contain all her delight and all her earnest desire of being loved by her sister. Before any answer could arrive from Mr. Collins, or any congratulations to Elizabeth from his wife, the Longbourn family heard that the Collinses were come themselves to Lucas Lodge. The reason of the sudden removal was soon evident. Lady Catherine had been rendered so exceedingly angry by the contents of her nephew's letter that Charlotte, really rejoicing the match, was anxious to get away till the storm was blown over. I cannot stand the anger. At such a moment the arrival of a friend was a sincere pleasure to Elizabeth, though in the course of their meetings she must sometimes think the pleasure dearly brought when she saw Mr. Darcy exposed to all the pardoning and obsequious civility of her husband. He bore it, however, with admirable calmness. He could even listen to Sir William Lucas when he complimented him on carrying away the brightest jewel of the country, and expressed his hopes of their all meeting frequently at St. James, with very decent composure. Yeah, it's like when you first get to know people, you're like, oh my god, they're too much. But then when you've fallen in love with one of their people, then you're like, I love this person. Of course I'll tolerate you, and I'll tolerate you, and I'll tolerate you, and everything's fine because I just love this person, and they're a part of your life, and I have to be a part of your life. You just things kind of roll off your chest a little bit more. I get it. If he did shrug his shoulders, it was not till Sir William's was out of sight. He said, shrug his shoulders. Mrs. Phillips's vulgarity was another, and perhaps a greater tax on his forbearance, and though Mrs. Phillips, as well as her sister, stood in too much awe of him to speak with a familiarity which Bingley's good humour encouraged, yet whatever she did speak, she must be vulgar. Nor was her respect for him, though it made her more quiet, at all likely to make him more elegant. Elizabeth did all she could to shield him from the frequent notice of either, and was ever anxious to keep him to herself, and to those of her family with whom he might converse without mortification. And though the uncomfortable feelings arising from all this took from the season of courtship much of its pleasure, it added to the hope of the future, and she looked forward with delight to the time when they should be removed from society so little pleasing to either, to all the comfort and elegance of their family party at Pemberley. Chapter 61. Happy for all her maternal feelings was the day on which Mrs. Bennet got rid of her 2 most deserving daughters. With what delighted pride she afterwards visited Mrs. Bingley, and talked of Mrs. Darcy may be guessed. I wish I could say, this is the first time I feel like I've seen the word I. Who is I? Whoa. I wish I could say Pride and Prejudice. Why does it say I? Who is I? This is so weird. Am I crazy? Who is the subject? Who is I? I don't even know how to ask this question. Pride and Prejudice, the I is the narrator telling the story. I don't feel like we've ever seen I before. I mean, you know, unless it's like in like a somebody talking. This is like the narrator saying I. Am I crazy? Whoa, this is really weird. It's tripping me out. First person point of view. Yeah, right. Why does Austen use the first person point of view in the following passage? Does this first person narration have any relevance to the story? What is the purpose of this use? This is an example of direct address to the reader of an omniscient narrator who offers facts, opinions, arguments, and moral judgments and expresses themselves as a character, not just a conduit for the story. The technique of direct address was popular in 18th and 19th centuries. Whoa. This is like tripping me out. This is the first time that the narrator has said I. Okay. Jane, you're tripping me out. I wish I could say for the sake of her family that the accomplishments of her earnest desire in the establishment of so many of her children produced so happy an effect as to make her a sensible, amiable, well-informed woman for the rest of her life. Mrs. Bennet. Though perhaps it was lucky for her husband, who might not have relished domestic felicity in so unusual a form, that she still was occasionally nervous and invariably silly. She was occasionally nervous and invariably silly, this woman that he married. Whoa, this I is tripping me out. This first person narrative is tripping me out. Huh. Well, Mr. Bennet missed his second daughter exceedingly. Oh, he really, like, Elizabeth was his favorite. His affection for her drew him oftener from home than anything else could do. He delighted in going to Pemberley, especially when he was least expected. Surprise! My God. Mr. Bingley and Jane remained at Netherfield only a 12-month, a year. So near a vicinity to her mother and Meryton, relations was not desirable, even to his easy temper and her affectionate heart. The darling wish of his sisters was then gratified. He brought an estate in a neighbouring county in Derbyshire, and Jane and Elizabeth, in addition to every other source of happiness, were within 30 miles of each other. Wow. Kitty, to her very maternal advantage, spent the chief of her time with her two elder sisters in society so superior to what she had generally known. Her improvement was great. Thank goodness we saved Kitty. She was not so ungovernable and a temper as Lydia, and removed from the influence of Lydia's example, she became, by proper attention and management, less irritable, less ignorant, and less insipid. From the further disadvantage of Lydia's society, she was, of course, carefully kept, and though Mrs. Wickham frequently invited her to come stay with her, with the promise of balls and young men, her father would never consent to her going. Good for him, he's actually taking an active part in her life. He said, for 10 years, you're never going to leave this house. Mary was the only daughter who remained at home, and will forever. And she's happy about it. If she could be a nun, she should go be a nun. Mary was the only daughter who remained at home, and she was necessarily drawn from the pursuit of accomplishments by Mrs. Bennet's being quite unable to sit alone. She said, "My mom needs a companion. I will be here for her." Mary was obliged to mix more with the world, but she could still moralize over every morning visit. And as she was no longer mortified by comparisons between her sisters' beauty and her own, it was suspected by her father that she submitted to change without much reluctance. To the change. Like menopause? As for Wickham and Lydia, their characters suffered no revolution from the marriage of her sisters. He bore with philosophy the conviction that Elizabeth must now become acquainted with whatever of his ingratitude and falsehood had before been unknown to her, and in spite of everything, was not wholly without hope that Darcy might yet be prevailed on to make his fortune. The congratulatory letter which Elizabeth received from Lydia on her marriage explained to her that by his wife at least, if not himself, such a hope was cherished. The letter was to this effect: "My dear Lizzie, I wish you joy. If you love Mr. Darcy half as well as I do love my dear Wickham." Oh, I don't know why I thought this was from Wickham. Okay. Congratulatory received from Lydia. Ugh, read and listen. Okay. "My dear Lizzie, I wish you joy. If you love Mr. Darcy half as well as I do my dear Wickham, you must be very happy. It is a great comfort to have you so rich, and when you have nothing else to do, I hope you will think of us. I am sure Wickham would like a place at court very much, and I do not think we shall have quite money enough to live upon without some help. Any place would do, of about 300 or 400 a year, but however, do not speak to Mr. Darcy about it if you rather not. Yours, etc." As it happened that Elizabeth had much rather not, she endeavoured in her answer to put an end to every entreaty and expectation of this kind. She said, "You're not asking me for money any more. Go away." Such relief, however, as it was in her power to afford, by the practice of what might be called economy in her own private expenses, she frequently sent them. It had always been evident to her that such an income as theirs, under the direction of two persons so extravagant in their wants and heedless of the future, must be very sufficient to their support, and whenever they changed their quarters, either Jane or herself were to be sure of being applied to for some little assistance towards discharging their bills. Their manner of living, even when the restoration of peace dismissed them to a home, was unsettled in the extreme. They were always moving from place to place in quest of a cheap situation, always spending more than they ought. His affection for her soon sunk into indifference. Hers lasted a little longer, and in spite of her youth and manners, she retained all the claims to reputation which a marriage had given her. Though Darcy could never receive him at Pemberley, yet for Elizabeth's sake he assisted him further in his profession. Lydia was occasionally a visitor there when her husband had gone to enjoy himself in London or Bath, and with Bingleys they both of them frequently stayed so long that even Bingley's good humour was overcome, and he proceeded so far as to talk of giving them a hint to be gone. Golly, Lydia's a mess. Wickham's a mess. Miss Bingley was very deeply mortified by Darcy's marriage. Miss Bingley. Oh, Charlotte. Yes. Miss Bingley was very deeply mortified. Yeah, right. But as she thought it advisable to retain, it was like Darcy had two women who he was supposed to marry, and he was like, no. Classic redirection. Been promised to this girl who's sick all the time. Not that there's anything wrong with that, since I was born, and this woman just assumes that I'm going to marry her, and Elizabeth hates me, and I'm going to marry her. Miss Bingley was very deeply mortified by Darcy's marriage, but as she thought it advisable to retain the right of visiting at Pemberley, she dropped all her resentment, was fonder than ever of Georgiana, of course, almost as attentive to Darcy as heretofore, and paid off every arrear of civility to Elizabeth. Pemberley was now Georgiana's home, and the attachment of the sisters was exactly what Darcy had hoped to see. Oh, they were able to love each other even as well as they intended. Georgiana has the highest opinion in the world of Elizabeth. though at first she often listened with an astonishment bordering on alarm at her lively, supportive manner of talking to her brother. He, who had always inspired in herself a respect which almost overcame her affection, she now saw the object of open pleasantry. Her mind received knowledge which had never before fallen in her way. By Elizabeth's instructions, she began to comprehend that a woman may take liberties with her husband, which a brother will not always allow in a sister more than 10 years younger than himself. A woman may take liberties with her husband, which a brother. What? What does that mean? A woman. Put the book down. A woman may take liberties with her husband. Pride and Prejudice. Yeah, I bet people are. Try to understand women take liberties with her husband. This insight comes after Elizabeth persuades her to do so. Several liberties that a wife can take linked to the physical liberty of marriage. A daughter missed her after. What does it mean? A quiz? No, I don't want a quiz. Oh my god. Okay, hold on. Oh. I gotta look it up. Chapter 61. This is the last chapter. Chapter 61. Anyways, not in. How disappointing. How disappointing. You guys. Okay, well, maybe somebody out there will help me with that, because that sounds weird. Like, yeah, your brother. What? A woman may take liberties with her husband, which a brother will not always allow in a sister. More than 10 years younger than himself. I don't get it. Lady Catherine was extremely indignant on the marriage of her nephew, and as she gave way to all the genuine frankness of her character in her reply to the letter which announced its arrangement, she sent him language so very abusive, especially of Elizabeth, that for some time all intercourse was at an end. But at length, by Elizabeth's persuasion, he was prevailed on to overlook the offence and seek a reconciliation. Of course he did. And after a little further resistance on the part of his aunt, her resentment gave way, either to her affection for him or her curiosity to see how his wife conducted herself, and she condescended to wait on them at Pemberley in spite of that pollution which its woods had received. All the something at Pemberley to be less polluted. Of her uncle and aunt from the city. No. And not merely from the presence of such a mistress, but the visit of her uncle and aunt from the city. With the Gardiners, they were always on the most intimate terms. That's sweet. Darcy, as well as Elizabeth, really loved them. And they were both ever sensible of the warmest gratitude towards the persons who, by bringing her into Derbyshire, had the means of uniting them. That's it! That was so surprising. I don't know why I thought there was another page. That's it. Okay. With the Gardiners, I got to. That surprised me. You guys. With the Gardiners, they were always on the most intimate terms. Darcy as well as Elizabeth really loved them, and they were both ever sensible of the warmest gratitude towards the persons who, by bringing her into Derbyshire, had the means of uniting them. Whoa. I still do want to, figure out that passage. Maybe just Georgiana's brother, Darcy, right, has less liberty with her than with his wife, which makes sense to me. I don't know if that's creepy to say it out loud, but that concludes me reading Pride and Prejudice out loud. At times it did feel like that one scene in Man on the Moon where he just sat and like Andy Kaufman just read The Great Gatsby to that audience. It's like everybody was not that it was that funny and I'm a comedian at all, but I just kept remembering that part of the movie and I thought it was funny. Well, happy reading to you all, and ta-ta, and welcome me back next reading. Let's come back to me whenever I come back to read Sense and Sensibility. And I hope we all can interact and have fun reading a book that I've never read before, and I have only seen the movie like twice, and I don't know that much about, so it'll be interesting. It'll be a little more rough, but hopefully I'll get into a little bit of a groove. Ta-ta, everyone. Happy reading. Bye.